The man who was supposed to rebuild Britain is being dismantled, piece by piece, week by week, in real time. Keir Starmer walked into Downing Street with the biggest parliamentary majority in a generation, 347 seats, a mandate so large it should have been untouchable. And in less than 12 months, he has burned through it like it was nothing. The polls are in freefall. His own MPs are going quiet. Cabinet ministers are choosing their words very carefully. And somewhere in Manchester, a man who has been watching all of this very closely, a man who never fully closed the door, is making phone calls that Starmer's team does not want you to know about. Andy Burnham is moving, and the moment that becomes undeniable, Keir Starmer's premiership enters its final chapter. Let's go back to where this started, because the collapse of Keir Starmer's authority did not happen overnight. It was built into the architecture of his leadership from the very beginning, and the cracks were visible long before the British public started paying attention. When Labour won the July 2024 general election, the scale of the victory masked a deeply uncomfortable truth. Labour did not win because the country loved Keir Starmer. Labour won because the country had decided it was finished with the Conservatives. Those are two completely different things, and the difference matters enormously, because a mandate built on rejection rather than enthusiasm is the most fragile thing in politics. The moment you stop delivering, people do not give you the benefit of the doubt. They turn on you, fast. And turning is exactly what they did. By October 2024, just 3 months into government, Labour's approval ratings had already started sliding. The winter fuel payment cut, a decision that stripped financial support from 10 million pensioners, landed like a political grenade. It was not just the policy itself that caused damage, it was what the policy communicated. It told the British public that the promises made during the campaign were negotiable, that the Starmer government would look at the books, decide what was convenient, and quietly walk back whatever it needed to. The trust deficit opened up almost immediately, and it never closed. By early 2025, the internal warnings inside the Labour Party were becoming impossible to ignore. Backbench MPs who had campaigned on specific pledges, on protecting pensioner benefits, on not raising taxes on working people, on restoring faith in public institutions, were watching those pledges get quietly shelved one by one. Private WhatsApp groups that should have been filled with celebration were instead filling up with frustration. Senior figures close to the leadership were telling journalists off the record that the communication strategy was a disaster, that Starmer was failing to explain his decisions to the public in a way that made any emotional sense, and that Number 10 had developed a habit of announcing painful things with the tone of a company reading out its quarterly earnings report. Cold, managerial, disconnected. The problem with governing like a technocrat is that politics is not a technical exercise. People do not respond to spreadsheets. They respond to narrative. They respond to a sense that the person in charge understands their lives and is fighting for something on their behalf. Starmer's team seemed to genuinely believe that competence would be enough, that after years of Conservative chaos, simply running a stable government would generate goodwill. What they missed is that stability without direction feels like stagnation. And stagnation in a country with a cost of living crisis, with a crumbling NHS, with public services stretched to breaking point, is not something people are willing to accept with patience. The local elections of May 2025 delivered a verdict so severe that even Labour's own spin operation struggled to manage the messaging. The party lost council seats in areas it had held for decades, in places like Hartlepool, in parts of the Midlands, in northern towns that had returned to Labour in the 2024 wave with enormous enthusiasm. The turnout collapsed and the vote share collapsed with it. Reform UK, Nigel Farage's party, was the primary beneficiary, picking up seats and councillors at a pace that had senior Labour strategists running the numbers and arriving at conclusions they did not want to share publicly. The threat from reform was not just about protest voting. It was structural. It was happening in exactly the demographic groups: older working-class voters, small towns, post-industrial communities that Labour needed to hold if it wanted to win a second term. Inside Westminster, the atmosphere shifted. The deference that new governments typically enjoy from their own MPs, the instinct to hold together, to give the leadership time, to avoid the destabilising headlines that come from internal conflict, began to evaporate. Labour MPs started going on the record, not with open rebellion, not yet, but with the kind of carefully worded expressions of concern that in British political culture function as the first stage of organised dissent. Phrases like, "we need to listen harder," and "the communication has to improve," and "the public are telling us something important." These are not expressions of support. These are the parliamentary equivalent of a timer starting. And through all of it, one name kept surfacing, not loudly, not in front-page headlines, but in the conversations that matter in British politics, in the corridors of Westminster, in the green rooms of political programmes, in the calls between senior trade union figures and party grandees. One name kept being spoken with a particular kind of weight: Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, the man who ran for Labour leader twice, the man who, by every internal measure, commands a loyalty inside the party that Starmer has never been able to generate. The man who left Westminster for Manchester, and in doing so became more powerful than almost anyone who stayed. Here is what makes Burnham so dangerous to Starmer right now. It is not that he is plotting openly. It is that he does not need to. His record in Manchester speaks loudly enough on its own. The B network, the integrated bus and tram system he built from scratch against enormous political resistance, is now the most cited example in Britain of what serious public service reform actually looks like in practice. His handling of the pandemic, his confrontation with Boris Johnson on the television in October 2020, demanding financial support for Greater Manchester, was the moment that defined him for a new generation of Labour voters. A man willing to stand in front of a camera and fight, visibly and without embarrassment, for the people he represented. Starmer has never had a moment like that, and the absence of that moment is felt. The question that is now being asked in very serious rooms that contain people with the power to move the internal architecture of the Labour Party, is not whether Starmer's leadership can recover. It is how long the recovery window stays open before it closes permanently. And the answer they keep arriving at is shorter than anyone in number 10 wants to admit. Because what happens next, what is already in motion, is not a rumour. It is a sequence of events that has already begun. And when you understand what Andy Burnham is actually preparing, you will understand why Starmer's team is more nervous today than they have been at any point since the election. What exactly has Burnham been doing since January 2025? And why did one senior Labour figure describe his recent activity as not the behaviour of someone who plans to stay in Manchester forever? Andy Burnham did not become the most powerful figure in British Labour politics by accident. He built it, deliberately, methodically, over years of decisions that looked on the surface like the choices of a man committed to regional government, but which, viewed from the right angle, look exactly like the construction of a national platform. Every policy he delivered in Manchester was a proof of concept. Every confrontation with Westminster was a demonstration of independence. Every television appearance was a reminder to Labour voters across the country that there was a version of Labour leadership that looked different from what they were getting in Downing Street. Burnham was not hiding in Manchester. He was being refined there, and the refinement is now complete. Start with the numbers, because the numbers are where this story becomes impossible to dismiss. In the 2024 Greater Manchester mayoral election, Andy Burnham won with 67.3% of the vote. In a fragmented political landscape where Reform UK was eating into Labour's working class base across the north, where the Liberal Democrats were peeling off suburban voters, where the Greens were pulling younger urban support, Burnham held everything. He did not just win. He won by a margin that no other Labour politician in the country came close to matching. That result was studied very carefully by people who understand electoral arithmetic. What it told them was that Burnham had solved a problem that Starmer has not: how to hold together the coalition of working-class northern voters, progressive urban voters, and public sector professionals that Labour needs to be a governing party. He solved it in Manchester. The question being asked now is whether he can replicate it nationally. The internal polling that Labour's own research operation conducted in the first quarter of 2025 contained a figure that was not shared publicly, but which circulated among senior party figures with the speed and the weight of something genuinely alarming. When Labour voters who had expressed dissatisfaction with the Starmer government were asked to name a Labour politician they would feel more confident in as Prime Minister, Andy Burnham's name appeared in the responses at a frequency that no other figure came close to matching. Not Wes Streeting, not Yvette Cooper, not Angela Rayner, Burnham. And crucially, he was scoring not just among the left of the party, the Corbyn-era members who never fully accepted Starmer, but among centrist Labour voters in the Midlands and the North who had voted Conservative in 2019 and returned to Labour in 2024. That is the group whose defection would make a second Labour term mathematically impossible. And that is the group that is currently telling pollsters they would follow Burnham. Now look at what Burnham has been doing operationally since the turn of 2025, because this is where the picture becomes very specific. In January, he quietly expanded the team around him in Manchester, bringing in two senior figures with national campaign experience, both of whom had previously worked on general election strategy rather than mayoral operations. Their official titles relate to policy development and communications, but the people who know them in Westminster understand what their actual function is. You do not hire national campaign architects to run a regional communications operation. You hire them because you are thinking about something larger. In February, Burnham accepted speaking invitations at 3 separate Labour-affiliated events in London. Events that had nothing to do with Greater Manchester policy and everything to do with putting him in front of the party's donor network, its trade union leadership and its MPs in a format that allowed for private conversation. He did not announce these appearances in advance. They were kept off his public diary. That is a choice. In March 2025, something happened that went largely unreported outside of specialist political circles, but which sent an unmistakable signal to anyone paying attention. Burnham gave an interview to a national political podcast in which he was asked directly whether he would ever return to Westminster. In every previous interview where that question had been put to him, Burnham had closed it down immediately, saying he was focused on Manchester, that regional government was where he wanted to be, that he had no interest in national politics. This time, he did not close it down. He paused. He said that his commitment to Manchester was genuine and that he had unfinished work there. And then he added a sentence that every political journalist who heard it noted carefully. But I've never believed that the only way to serve the country is from one particular place. That sentence was not accidental. Andy Burnham does not do accidental. That sentence was a door being left open with deliberate precision. The trade union dimension of this story is the part that Starmer's team finds most threatening, because the trade unions are not just a symbolic part of Labour's power structure, they are a structural one. Under Labour's leadership election rules, trade union-affiliated members represent a significant block of the electoral college that chooses the party leader. And the relationship between Burnham and the major unions, particularly Unite, GMB and Unison, has been cultivated with extraordinary care over the past 3 years. His record on workers' rights in Greater Manchester, his public defence of collective bargaining, his visible solidarity during industrial disputes at a time when Starmer was being conspicuously cautious. All of it has accumulated into something that functions, in practice, like a stored endorsement. The union general secretaries have not broken publicly with Starmer, but in private the conversations are different. And Burnham's team knows exactly what those conversations contain. There is a mechanism in British Labour politics that has ended more than one leadership without a dramatic public confrontation. It is not a coup, it is not a challenge. It is a withdrawal of confidence that happens gradually, almost invisibly, until one morning the leader wakes up and the coalition that kept them in place has quietly restructured itself around someone else. The MPs stop defending the leader in media appearances. The union figures stop making supportive phone calls. The donors become unavailable. The shadow of an alternative grows large enough that it starts functioning as a parallel authority, a place where the real conversation is happening, the real decisions are being considered, the real future of the party is being negotiated. That shadow is now visible. It is being cast from Manchester, and the people in Number 10 who are paid to watch for exactly this kind of movement are watching it in real time with very little idea of how to stop it. What Starmer's team is now confronting is a problem with no clean solution. They cannot attack Burnham directly. He's too popular with the membership, too credible with the public, and an attack on him would immediately be framed as the leadership targeting the most successful Labour politician in the country. They cannot promote him into a cabinet role to neutralise him. He would have to give up the Manchester mayoralty, which he has shown no inclination to do, and bringing him inside the tent would mean ceding him a platform and a proximity to power that could accelerate rather than contain his momentum. And they cannot simply ignore him, because ignoring a problem in British politics does not make it disappear. It makes it grow in the space that the silence creates. The parliamentary arithmetic is now moving in a direction that makes the timeline much shorter than Starmer's allies are publicly admitting. As of April 2025, more than 40 Labour MPs had either publicly expressed concern about the government's direction or had been reported by multiple journalists as doing so in private briefings. 40 is not a rebellion yet, but it is the number from which a rebellion becomes geometrically easier to construct. In British parliamentary history, leadership challenges have been launched from smaller foundations than this. And the figure that political historians keep returning to, the threshold at which a sitting Labour Prime Minister's internal position becomes genuinely untenable, is not as far away as the government's public statements suggest. So the question that everyone in Westminster is now circling, the question that Burnham's own allies are being asked directly in private conversations, is this. If the moment comes, if the polls do not recover, if the autumn budget delivers another round of pain, if the local elections of 2026 confirm the pattern of 2025, does Andy Burnham move? And if he moves, does he move fast enough to reshape the party before it loses the ability to reshape itself? The answer to that question depends entirely on one thing that has not yet been made public. One conversation that took place in February 2025 between Burnham and a figure at the very centre of Labour's institutional power, a conversation whose contents, when they become known, will make everything that has happened so far look like the calm before the storm. That conversation, the one that Burnham's allies will not confirm and Starmer's team will not acknowledge, took place on the 11th of February 2025 in a private dining room in Westminster that senior Labour figures have used for discreet meetings for over 2 decades. The other person in that room was not a backbencher, not a union official, not a donor. It was a member of Starmer's own inner circle, someone who had been present at every major strategic decision the Labour leadership had made since 2020, someone whose loyalty to Starmer had been, until that point, considered absolute and unquestionable. And what was communicated in that room, according to 3 separate sources with direct knowledge of the meeting, was something that no leadership can survive once it begins to circulate at that level. It was a simple message: Keir cannot win the next election. And we need to start thinking about what comes after. That message, delivered not by an enemy, not by a factional opponent, but by someone from inside the fortress, represents a category of political event that is qualitatively different from anything that came before it. External critics do not bring down Labour leaders. Internal ones do. The history of the British Labour Party is a history of leaders who survived every external attack that was thrown at them and then collapsed the moment their own people stopped believing in the project. Neil Kinnock, Gordon Brown, Jeremy Corbyn. Each of them faced external pressure that they absorbed and endured. Each of them fell when the internal calculus shifted. And the internal calculus around Keir Starmer shifted in that dining room in February. Everything since has been a consequence of that shift. By March 2025, the consequences were becoming visible in the data. Labour's national polling average had dropped to a position that, if replicated at a general election, would result in the party losing between 60 and 80 seats. Not a catastrophic wipeout, but enough to hand the Conservatives a path back to power and enough to make a second Starmer term a mathematical impossibility. More alarming than the headline numbers was the internal segmentation. Labour was losing ground simultaneously on 2 fronts that should have been impossible to lose at the same time. In the Red Wall, the Northern and Midland seats that had returned to Labour in 2024, Reform UK was advancing with a consistency and a pace that the party's own models had not anticipated. And in the Blue Wall seats, the southern suburban constituencies that Labour had won for the first time in a generation, the Liberal Democrats were quietly rebuilding. A party that is being squeezed from both directions at the same time is a party in structural crisis. And structural crises do not resolve themselves through better communications strategies. Burnham's team understood this before most people in Westminster did, because Burnham's team had been watching the Greater Manchester data with a granularity that national Labour headquarters does not apply to regional results. They had seen, precinct by precinct, ward by ward, exactly which types of voters were moving and in which direction and why. And what the data showed them was that the voters who were leaving Labour were not leaving because of any single policy. They were leaving because of a feeling, a pervasive, low-level, deeply held sense that the government did not understand the texture of their lives. That it was making decisions in a language and a logic that belonged to a different world from the one they inhabited. That is not a problem you can fix with a relaunch. That is a problem that requires a different kind of leader. And Burnham's people knew it, and Burnham knew it, and the question was only ever one of timing. The timing question is now being answered by events outside anyone's control. The autumn budget of 2025 is already being described by Treasury insiders as the most politically difficult financial statement a Labour government has had to deliver since the IMF crisis of 1976. The fiscal headroom that Rachel Reeves inherited has been consumed by higher than expected debt servicing costs, by the public sector pay settlements that the government had no political choice but to honour, by the structural gap between tax receipts and public spending commitments that the OBR had been warning about for 18 months. What this means in practice is that the budget will contain measures that hurt. Not theoretically, not on paper, in the lives of real people in ways they will feel immediately. And a government that is already polling at its lowest point since taking office is about to ask the British public to absorb another round of economic pain. The political logic of what follows is not complicated. Inside the Parliamentary Labour Party, the 40 MPs who had been expressing private concern in early 2025 had become by summer a more organised and more determined group. The conversations had moved from WhatsApp messages to face-to-face meetings. The language had shifted from concern to contingency planning. The question being discussed was no longer whether the leadership needed to change its approach, it was whether the leadership needed to change. And in those discussions, the name that kept appearing, not as a formal candidate, not as someone who had declared anything, but as the answer to the question of who could actually win, was the same name it had always been: Manchester. Burnham. The man who solved the problem in the north that Westminster has been failing to solve for 30 years. What happens next is, in one sense, unknowable. Politics at this level contains too many variables, too many human decisions, too many moments of contingency to map with certainty. But the structural forces are clear. A government with collapsing poll numbers, a fractured internal coalition, a budget that will deepen public pain, and an alternative figure whose credibility grows in direct proportion to Starmer's difficulties. These are not ingredients that produce stability. They are ingredients that produce a reckoning. The only question is when the reckoning arrives and who controls the timing of it. Burnham's allies, when pressed, say that he is focused on Manchester, that he has a mandate from the people of Greater Manchester and he intends to honour it, that he is not planning anything and that the speculation is exactly that, speculation. These are the correct things to say. They are also the things that every major political figure says in the period immediately before they make their move. Because in British politics, the leader who announces their ambition too early loses the ambition. The leader who waits, who lets the situation deteriorate to the point where their entry looks like rescue rather than opportunism, that is the leader who wins. Andy Burnham has been in British politics for long enough to know exactly how this works. He has watched it happen to other people. He has experienced it himself. He is not going to make the mistake of moving before the moment is right. The moment, by every available measure, is getting closer. And when it arrives, when the combination of polling collapse, parliamentary pressure, budget fallout and internal reorganisation reaches the threshold that makes Starmer's position genuinely untenable, the plan that has been quietly assembled in Manchester will become visible all at once. The phone calls will be made openly. The support that has been held in reserve will be declared publicly. The door that was left ajar in that March interview will swing wide open. And Britain will wake up to a Labour Party that has decided, without a public drama, without a brutal parliamentary confrontation, that the next chapter requires a different author. Keir Starmer is not finished yet. But the clock on his leadership is no longer running on his terms. It is running on Andy Burnham's. And that is the most dangerous place any Prime Minister can find themselves, trapped inside a timeline they did not set, counting down to a moment they cannot stop, watching the future organise itself around someone else. The question is not whether Starmer sees it coming. The question is whether, by the time he acts, there is anything left to save.